Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 574, The Kings of the Ring, Part 1. So when I was debating the idea of a sort of historicized biography, I quickly narrowed down my list of potential topics to a few suspects. Miyazaki Manabu was of course the one I ultimately picked, largely because of how well documented his life is and because of the insane things he got up to, but there were a group of people who were my second place choices. And hey, it's my podcast, so nobody can stop me from just rolling on to them next. Besides, I was really excited about this potential topic because of one of the ways this podcast has affected my own life. You see, way back in episode 243, I did an episode on the history of sumo wrestling. In a sense, it's Japan's national sport, though much to the chagrin of old-timers, it's also somewhat on the decline today. Baseball is, of course, by far the most popular sport in the country, with sumo in the number 2 spot for a long time, but recently soccer has started to supplant it, and current surveys show that of the top 10 most recognized athletes in Japan, none of them are rikishi, sumo wrestlers. So it's a sport that's kind of in crisis, in part because, particularly in Japan, it's perceived as a bit old-fashioned, something for oyaji, for old men slamming Karens as they yell at their TV sets, that sort of vibe. In part, the sport also has an image problem from its many recent scandals. About a decade and a half ago, there was a big one involving revelations that matches at the highest level had been fixed by the wrestlers participating in them, to go along with smaller scandals associated with the behavior of specific athletes that you see in pretty much every sport. In a word, modern sumo has issues, but also it's just honestly very fun. And in part because of that episode, I started watching a couple of tournaments where I could, and especially over the last year and a half, I've started watching a lot more, and really come to appreciate sumo as a sport, and I decided I wanted to do more with its history. So this is a mini-series that's about sumo history, and especially what that history shows us about the idea of Japaneseness, Japanese identity, because as we'll see, those ideas are bound up both with sumo in general and the lives of our subjects in particular. Of course, this is also an attempt on my part to boost the number of non-Japanese people watching sumo because, honestly, I think it's really fun, but I would also be remiss not to note that NHK makes it very hard to watch more than highlights from the top division anywhere outside of Japan. So this is also me pleading to anyone associated with the sumo world more closely to make it easier for me to actually pay to watch the damn tournament instead of having to deal with illegal streams. I swear I would pay you if I could, and maybe if enough of us say that, they'll actually take my damn money. Anyway, the next couple of episodes are going to focus on some of the most famous figures of modern sumo, on their history and their legacies, and we're going to start with probably the single most famous figure in post-war sumo, maybe ever. Like all rikishi, he's best known by his shikona, his ring name. That shikona has a family and personal name to it, usually based on others from that wrestler's lineage. In his case, it's Taiho Koki, though usually wrestlers are just known by the first name, by the family name, Taiho. The future Taiho wouldn't get that name until much later in his life, though I am going to stick to my usual practice and just refer to him by his most famous name going forward. But right from the jump, Taiho had a pretty fascinating life, and his name is a big part of that, because the name he was born with was Ivan Borishko. Now, those of you with a keenly honed sense for these things will note that that is not a traditional Japanese name, but young Taiho was not a traditional Japanese boy. His mother, Naya Kyo, was a Japanese national. I never really found that much information about her, but what matters for us is that early in her life, she settled in what was then called Karafuto Prefecture. I imagine a few of you are running down your mental maps of Japan right now, being like, wait, where the hell is that? I've never heard of that prefecture. And the reason you haven't is because it no longer exists. Karafuto is the Japanese name for Sakhalin Island. That long, thin island north of Hokkaido was once Japanese territory. It was actually first settled during the Tokugawa years as a part of the wide-ranging system of exploitation of the indigenous Ainu population of Hokkaido, Sakhalin, and the nearby Kuril Islands. There was never a big Japanese presence on Sakhalin during this time, just a couple of merchants and officials from the nearby Matsumaya domain who were responsible for managing Japanese trading interests in the region. By the start of the modern era, the beginning of the Meiji period, the new imperial government of Japan made the decision to abandon its claim on Sakhalin to another imperial power in the region, Russia, in exchange for Russia acknowledging Japan's control over the Kuril Islands. But in 1905, the Japanese would come back. One of the last campaigns of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 involved Japanese troops landing in Sakhalin, and when the Russians finally agreed to peace in 1905, one of the conditions they agreed to was ceding control of the southern half of Sakhalin to the Japanese. Southern Sakhalin would remain under Japanese control until 1945, first as a colony and then eventually as a full prefecture, with the government promoting settlement of the island to help exploit coal and oil deposits as well as fish and timber. Naya-kyo was one such settler, working as a dressmaker on the island for its growing population after moving to Sakhalin from her family's home in northern Hokkaido. Taiho's father, on the other hand, took a very different route to Sakhalin. His name was Markian Berishko, and he was born in what was then the Russian Empire, though not in Russia proper. He was from Kharkov Oblast in what's now the eastern part of Ukraine, born sometime in either 1885 or 1888. So far as I know, there are no records from his hometown, and the Japanese records from the old colonial government are not consistent regarding his year of birth. What we know for sure is that Markian Berishko was, like Naya-kyo, a colonizer sent to the region by his government. The Russian government, hoping to solidify its claim on its far eastern territories, encouraged resettlement from the far more populous European Russia into the east. Sometimes, of course, this was done as punishment for the uppity, but so far as we know, the Berishko family volunteered, and Markian resettled with his parents in northern Sakhalin. Some of the records I found, incidentally, call his family Cossacks, a distinct ethnic group that the Russians, among others, gave some self-governing rights to in exchange for their military service as cavalry officers, because the Cossacks were traditionally nomads and thus pretty good riders. Today, the Cossacks, with their distinct history and culture, are the subject of much Ukrainian nationalist storytelling. They're a big part of the national narrative of modern Ukraine. If you are not Ukrainian and you've heard of them, I imagine it's because, like me, you are Jewish, because for Jews, the Cossacks are often referred to like boogeymen. Cossack communities were often involved in pogroms against Jewish communities in Imperial Russia. Growing up, I didn't even actually know what a Cossack was other than scary and bad, because I knew from the stories I heard growing up that nothing good ever happened when they showed up in the Old Country. If they were a Cossack family, that would explain what the Berishkos were doing out east, helping to garrison a vulnerable area, and why Markian in particular was not conscripted to fight in World War I, since my understanding is that Cossack rules around military service were a bit different. But again, they're not consistently called Cossacks in the sources I've seen, so I'm not totally sure what the deal is here. Anyway, the Berishkos lived in northern Sakhalin, which meant that Markian was not subject to the Japanese invasion during 1905. They never made it that far north. However, just 12 years later, the Berishkos would see their own government implode in the Russian Revolution. Northern Sakhalin was initially controlled during the revolution by forces loyal to the Whites, the pro-Tsarist side of the Civil War, and then after 1920 by the Far Eastern Republic, a sort of buffer state set up to manage the region with the tacit approval of the Soviet Union. But in 1922, the Far Eastern Republic, including northern Sakhalin, would be annexed by the Soviet Union, and Markian Berishko, who supported the anti-Soviet side of the Civil War, would flee to avoid being killed by the new regime. Like many other so-called White Russians, in other words monarchist Russians, he would flee to the territory of a neighboring power which was deeply ideologically hostile to Russia's new communist government, Japan. And so that's how Marky and Berishko ended up in what was then called Shikuka County in the center of Sakhalin, just south of the Japanese-Soviet border. It's now Poroneisky district in the Sakhalin Oblast. There he met Naya Kyo, his second wife actually, after having a daughter with a Russian woman he'd previously been married to. It's unclear what happened either to the first wife or the daughter, but by 1928, Markian Berishko and Naya Kyo were married. Markian made a living as a shepherd on Sakhalin while Naya Kyo continued to make dresses, and on May 29, 1940, they had a son, Ivan Berishko, the future Taiho. Now, Taiho would not spend much of his life on Sakhalin because, of course, Sakhalin was not going to stay Japanese that much longer. Over the night of August 8th to 9th, 1945, the Soviet Union, which in the grand tapestry of World War II politics actually previously hadn't been at war with Japan, since the Japanese had not followed the Nazis in declaring war on the Soviets, decided to take advantage of Japan's bad situation. Turns out that Joseph Stalin guy, not the most trustworthy. Who knew? Anyway, in violation of an existing non-aggression pact between the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the Japanese Empire, the Soviets, with American encouragement, declared war on Japan and immediately launched a massive attack on Japanese positions in Asia, which by this point largely had been stripped of their defenses in an effort to try and ward off the advance of the United States towards Japan from the south. And starting on August 11th, elements of the Soviet military, 100,000 soldiers and sailors, mostly battle-hardened veterans of the Soviet 16th Army, began to advance from northern Sakhalin into the southern part of the island. They overran the whole island in the course of about 2 weeks. Japanese defenses in the entirety of northern Japan consisted of about 19,000 soldiers and another 10,000 reservists, and that was only on paper, since there weren't even enough weapons or ammunition by this time to fully equip more than 60% of that number. Given those odds, the loss of Sakhalin was pretty much an inevitability. Taiho and his mother were able to flee south to the port that was then called Otomari, today it's Korsakov on the southern tip of the island, and from there load onto one of the evacuation ships headed back to Japan proper, called the Ogasawara Maru. Now, the Ogasawara Maru was scheduled to go all the way to Otaru in the southern third of Hokkaido, not that far from the prefectural capital of Sapporo. But Taiho's mother, Naya Kyo, was not feeling very well. Apparently she had bad seasickness, and so the two of them disembarked at Wakanai, the first stop the Ogasawara Maru made in northern Hokkaido, along with some other passengers. That turned out to be a stroke of incredible fortune because on the way to Otaru, the Ogasawara Maru would run into a Soviet submarine which would mistake it for a warship and sink a boat full of civilians, one of 3 refugee ships torpedoed by the Soviet Union on August 22, 1945, killing in total north of 1,500 civilians. It's still not entirely clear which Soviet vessels were responsible. The Soviet government didn't even admit responsibility for the sinking until after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but by August 22nd, all the other Allied navies had received orders to stop fighting because Japan had announced its surrender. That Stalin guy, not a great guy. Again, who could have seen it coming? Taiho and his mother were able to dodge that fate, but I imagine you're wondering, what about his father? What about Markian Berishko? Berishko was not a Japanese national when the war ended. It is, of course, famously pretty challenging to get Japanese citizenship if you are not ethnically Japanese. Actually, from my understanding, he would have been eligible. He was married to a Japanese woman, which by the pre-1945 laws made him the legal head of household for the family, and thus should have opened a path to naturalization. But for whatever reason, he didn't, and so he had to stay behind. Neither Taiho nor his mother Naya Kyo knew what happened to him at that point, and so I'm not going to tell you either. But given that he was a white Russian who literally left the Soviet Union out of opposition to communist rule, probably nothing good. Now, Taiho would have been 5 when he was fleeing Sakhalin, and so remembered only flashes of his life on the island as a young boy. Most of his memories would have been later, as the child of a single mother who had been, like so many war refugees, uprooted and relocated. Specifically, the family would end up at Teshikaga, a small village on the eastern end of Hokkaido, the poorest and least developed region of the island. Taiho would grow up at first the child of a single parent, never easy, of course, and especially in a war-racked, impoverished nation. His mother would eventually remarry to a teacher by the name of Sumiyoshi, and so the future Taiho did at one point have his name legally changed to Sumiyoshi, and it was around this time he started using the first name Koki, meaning something like rejoicing in happiness, so more aspirational than anything else. Given his mother's new marriage, well, teachers are not exactly known for making bank, and in the immediate post-war, everyone was poor, especially low-ranking civil servants, working for a government that could barely keep the lights on without American help, and especially one doing so in the least developed part of Japan. And so even with two household incomes, the family was still very poor, and Taiho moved around a great deal, as his new stepfather's teaching posts were constantly being rotated. At the age of 10, Taiho even got a part-time job selling everyone's favorite Japanese delicacy, natto, to help the family make a little extra money. Unfortunately, the marriage didn't work out long-term, and shortly thereafter, Taiho's mother divorced her second husband, and so Taiho returned to using the name Naya Koki, and the two of them returned to having even less money than before, eking out a living on Naya Kyo's seamstress work and Taiho's selling of natto. Given their economic desperation, it only makes sense that when, in 1956, Taiho's big break came, he was willing to take a chance. So, let's talk about sumo. Sumo is, of course, Japan's oldest sporting traditions, if not one of the oldest ones in the world, and of course I've already netted myself a million angry emails just from phrasing it that way, because from one perspective, sumo is not just a sporting tradition. The practice has its origins in ancient Japanese history, and it has long had religious connotations. Even today, ceremonial wrestling is a part of certain Shinto religious festivals, and of course there are a lot of shrines associated with sumo, even in the modern era. Of course, sumo also has a seedier side to its history, as it became a hotbed of gambling and other vices, and so at points in Japan's history, the sport was either banned or heavily restricted because of its involvement in promoting vice. But sumo was just too popular to do away with altogether, especially among the increasingly powerful samurai class. Oda Nobunaga, the great warlord and the first of the unifiers of Japan in the mid-1500s, was famously a sumo fanatic and sponsored several tournaments in his home castle. During the age of the Tokugawa dynasty of shoguns, sumo promoters finally found a solution to the sport's respectability problem, organizing tournaments with the support of religious institutions, Shinto shrines, and Buddhist temples. The tournaments would thus be beneficial to those institutions, part of the money for tickets would go to helping the temples maintain themselves, and because they were now, to an extent, charitable, and because religious institutions enjoyed a lot of legal leeway in the Tokugawa system, the authorities were a lot more hands-off. It was a win-win for everyone involved. This is also why Shinto today retains a lot of religious aspects. For example, the Gyoji, the referee, dresses in an outfit more representative of a shrine priest than a sporting official. The dohyo, the earthen mound atop which the wrestlers fight, has sacred objects buried inside it and is covered by a roof built in the style of a shrine. Until 1952, that roof was held in place by massive wooden columns, but to give TV cameras and spectators a better view, those were replaced with a massive set of wires that hold the roof in place. Wrestlers in the top division even throw salt to purify the ring before bouts. Now, the current incarnation of sumo is actually relatively modern because during the Tokugawa years, the sport had no central governing body in any meaningful sense of that term. There were instead several independent organizations based primarily in Edo, what's now Tokyo, as well as Osaka, the various breakaways and splinterings and reconnectings of which are well beyond our scope here. The upshot of all of this is that it wasn't until the 20th century, 1925, that the current national organization which manages the sport, the Japan Sumo Association, came together in its current form out of the merger of those existing organizations. Thus, sumo is, in one sense, one of the most ancient organized sports in the world, and in another sense, newer than Major League Baseball, the National Hockey League, and the National Football League. The Japan Sumo Association is, to this day, in charge of the sport's major annual tournaments. Currently, there are 6 a year, but before 1958, the number of tournaments would vary, somewhere between 2 and 5. In 1956, there were only 4, which among other things allowed for more of what is called jungyo, traveling sumo exhibitions during the off-season, which don't count for the official tournament records. These are intended to give fans who lived far from the major venues in central Japan a chance to see matches live, and to drum up interest in the sport in general. The future Taiho was at one such jungyo event which took place in Hokkaido in 1956 in the small town of Kuneppu, along the remote eastern coast of the island. The event was hosted by one of the major heya, a term that literally just means room but is often translated in the sumo context as stable. The various heya are in essence schools of sumo. Each one is a collection of wrestlers that lives together, trains together, and socializes together. They operate under the authority of an oyakata, an elder, who is a former wrestler themselves. Once upon a time, an elder needed sponsorship from someone independently wealthy, say a feudal lord back in the day, or an independent businessman in the early imperial period, to set up a heya. Now, all of the elders are members of the Japan Sumo Association, eligible for stock in the association that also gives them a voice in its decisions. That stock also gives you the right to set up your own heya. The eligibility requirements are very complicated and usually involve a combination of factors based on your highest rank in the sport, more about that in a second, and the longevity of your career. Now, the specific stable, the heya, that was managing this tour in Hokkaido was Nishonoseki Beya, and if you follow sumo at all, that is a name you probably recognize. So, all sumo heya today belong to one of 5 ichimon, a term that is usually translated as family or clan. These are essentially genealogies of sumo tradition. If one heya, one stable, has enough very talented wrestlers who rise high enough they could start their own stables, only one of them can take over the leadership of the current heya, so the others will leave and found their own, but remain connected as part of the same ichimon. Within each ichimon, there is one stable that lends its name to the overall group, owing to its specific history and prestige. Those 5 groups are Dewa no Umi, Tokitsukaze, Takasago, Isegahama, and Nishonoseki. In other words, the group of wrestlers Taiho saw on this tour would have been from Nishonoseki Beya, one of the most prestigious backgrounds you can have in sumo. They were led by Saganohana Katsumi. Again, that's a shikona, a ring name, so when he was an active wrestler, he would have just been called Saganohana. Saganohana was the oyakata, the master of the stable, and an accomplished wrestler in his own right. During his career, from 1934 to 1952, he'd climbed the ranks of the sport all the way to the position of Ozeki, champion, the second highest position you can attain. Saganohana had been a great wrestler in his day, which was why he was able to become an oyakata. His overall record was 263 wins to 189 losses, mostly spanning the 3 tournaments a year era of sumo. Unfortunately for him, Saganohana also had a reputation for being kind of a jerk and unpleasant to work with. Not really a welcoming man in general, but maybe that didn't really matter. Because when Taiho saw sumo for the first time, he was fascinated, and Saganohana, in turn, apparently saw something in this young kid who was more or less just old enough at 16 to be in the prime age to start training as a rikishi, a sumo wrestler. Nayakiyo herself was also a bit unsure whether or not this was the right fit for her son. What apparently convinced her was seeing chanko nabe, the stew sumo wrestlers eat, to provide them with enough calories to gain the amounts of weight they need to compete. And coming from a poor background, I can see how "my son will definitely not go hungry" could be a compelling argument. And indeed, during the early post-war era of deprivation, Many sumo stables had no problems at all recruiting because a solid meal and a decent home was plenty of draw in its own right. And so Naya Kyo agreed to send her son off to the nation's capital at Tokyo, where he would join Nishono Sekibeya as a rikishi, one of their wrestlers in training. To do this, Taiho had to drop out of high school, and as far as I know, he never actually finished. That wasn't uncommon for rikishi to do at that time. Sumo, in terms of the training demands, is a professional sport. And like most sports, if you want to be seriously competitive, the absolute latest you can start seriously training full-time is your mid-teenage years. These days, you see a lot more kids coming out of high school or even college programs and into the big leagues, but by Taiho's day, it was pretty much drop out of high school and start going full-time, or you're gonna bust. So as a junior trainee, Taiho's lifestyle would have been grueling. Life in a sumo heya is hard for anyone doing it. Trainees are typically up at 5 a.m. to start training. That training involves a combination of strength exercises, naturally, as well as others to promote flexibility, particularly in the hips. This is very important because executing some of the throws that high-level competition requires a lot of flexibility. That's also why, if you've ever seen sumo's flexibility training, it looks brutal. The most common version I've seen involves sitting on the ground with your legs spread apart as far as possible, and then leaning forward to stretch. If you don't go down far enough, your fellow trainees are told to push you deeper into the stretch, even if it hurts. In fact, especially if it hurts. The other common type of training is something called shiko, a type of flexibility and strength exercise that's intended to work the most important muscles in sumo, your legs and core. My deeply inexpert description of how to do it: start with your legs more than shoulder width apart, hands on your knees, raise one leg up as high as it can go, and I mean as high as you can get it. You will see rikishi who can get their foot well up above their heads, so that it looks like their legs are verging on making a straight line. Then take that raised leg, stomp it down, and do a squat, and repeat with the other leg. Now do that a few hundred times every single day, and you'll be well on the road to success in the ring. These days, you see more conventional exercises like shiko supplemented by modern weight training, but that didn't start until well after Taiho's day, with the 1980s career of the great Chiyono Fuji, who, clocking in at 260 pounds or just under 118 kilograms, was one of the lightest sumo wrestlers ever to reach the pinnacle of the sport, but who supplemented his smaller body with very aggressive weight training and one hell of a muscular physique. But in Taiho's day, that sort of weight training just was not done, and from my understanding, though I am not an expert, sumo weight training today can still vary a lot from heya to heya, and is nowhere near as advanced as what you see in, say, American football, where a lot more money has been poured into figuring out how to strengthen up competitors as effectively as possible. Beyond these exercises, of course, you'd be doing a lot of training bouts, either full-on matches or exercises where, say, you have to push a resisting opponent backwards across the ring. All told, a day's training is exhausting, and it is partially to sustain that level of activity that rikishi also intake an average of 5,000 to 7,000 calories worth of food every day. That intake is, of course, also intended to bulk them up, for much the same reason, to return to the example of American football, that you see offensive and defensive linemen bulk up. With apologies to the rest of the planet, American football is probably the closest analog in terms of training requirements to sumo today, and so I'll be referencing it on occasion. Anyway, the reason all of this bulk is necessary has to do with the rules of the sport itself. If you're not familiar, the basic premise is straightforward. Wrestlers meet on what is called a dohyo, the ring on which they wrestle, which has a diameter of 4.5 meters, about 15 feet. At the start of the match, both wrestlers must have both of their hands touching the clay of the dohyo, and then they come at each other. The first one to step out or be forced out of the circumference of the dohyo, or to touch the ground itself with anything other than the bottom of their feet, loses the match. There are some fouls, no close-handed hitting, no kicks above the knee, no eye gouges, and no pulling of the opposing wrestler's top knot are the big ones. But other than that, it's pretty no-holds-barred in terms of what's allowed. The most common way to get someone down and out is either by pushing them out of the ring or throwing them. And of course, the easiest way to resist that is by having a lot of bulk to absorb your opponent's momentum. By the same token, since your own mass is a factor in how hard you can push your opponent back when you slam into them, having some bulk on your end is pretty handy. This is why the average rikishi today is in the mid 300 pounds, around 160 kilograms, in terms of weight. Again, you don't have to be that big to win. Chiyo Fuji, who really popularized weight training in sumo, was nowhere close. And during the early part of Taiho's career, one of the yokozuna, the highest rank you can attain, was only 110 kilograms, or 243 pounds. That would be Tochi no Umi, the 49th yokozuna, if you're curious. Even today, there are top division wrestlers who are on the smaller side who do pretty well consistently. One of them, Midorifuji Kazunari, is, in my experience, something of a fan favorite. But generally speaking, the trend has been for rikishi to get bigger as time has gone on. The extra advantages of that weight are just too much to get around. If you're wondering, at his peak, Taiho would average 153 kilograms, just over 337 pounds, at a height of 187 centimeters, just barely under 6 foot 2 inches. Now, as an initiate trainee, Taiho would have had to endure all of this, the training, the bulking, the lack of sleep, the exhaustion, the injuries, and more. And because Heya also have a very strict hierarchy, the lower-ranking wrestlers, the new initiates, are also assigned as attendants or helpers to the higher-ranking wrestlers in their stables, based on everyone's position in probably the most important part of their sumo career, the bansuke. Now, at its core, the bansuke is simply a ranking system published in advance of every honbasho, the major official tournaments, which grades wrestlers on a hierarchy. The bansuke system has its origins back in the Tokugawa years, as do the names of many of the ranks, but the current system was standardized by the Japan Sumo Association, which manages most of the ranking, though not all of it. The core concept is straightforward enough. Your record after each tournament determines how you do. More wins than losses, which is called a kachikoshi, will lift you up the ranks most of the time, though it can depend on whether or not there are slots open above you in the bansuke ranks. More losses than wins, called a makekoshi, will see you go down the ranks, though how bad your record is will determine how far you drop. Each honbasho, or official tournament, lasts 15 days, and each day of the tournament runs from the bottom of the bansuke to the top. In other words, you start with the lowest ranking wrestlers and then finish with the highest ranking ones. Again, the ordering and the numbers of the ranks has varied over time, but the current version standardized by the JSA, the Japan Sumo Association, was also the one from Taiho's day, so that's what we're going to worry about. At the very bottom of the bansuke, not even on the chart, is Maezumo, the pre-sumo ranks. These are amateurs looking for a spot on the bansuke, looking to join the official competition in Ozumo, or Grand Sumo, the name used to distinguish these tournaments sponsored by the Japan Sumo Association from, say, amateur competition or college sports or what have you. If you do well in these unofficial matches, you will get a spot in the Jonokuchi division, the lowest level rank there is on the bansuke, which usually has between 40 and 90 wrestlers in it. Fight long enough and hard enough and you'll get bumped up to Jonidan, the next division, which also has no fixed size and usually includes hundreds of wrestlers. Above that is Sandanme, which used to have 200 wrestlers, now it's just 160, and then finally is Makushita, below the curtain, with 120. Wrestlers in these four lowest divisions are different from their counterparts in the top divisions in a few ways. First, they fight fewer matches in the tournament. In Taiho's day, it was 8 out of the 15 days. Today, it's only 7 bouts instead of all 15, because each day of the tournament is already like 8 hours long, and those ranks take up like 5 hours of that time. Second, wrestlers in this division are forbidden from wearing nicer clothing. Until you hit Makushita, you're not even allowed to wear a heavier yukata, or overcoat, to keep you warm in the winter. Third, you are not paid in these divisions. You get room and board, a place to live, and food from your heya, sustained by the heya's share of the profit from the Japan Sumo Association, but that's it. Fourth, you are usually kept busy serving the higher-ranking wrestlers in your stable, since you are also doing less matches. If you make it to the top of Makushita and keep winning, and that's hard to do, a lot of people get stuck, they cap out in the upper Makushita ranks, you make it to Juryo, a name that literally means 10 ryo, ryo being the gold coins of the Tokugawa years. As the name implies, that's the first division where you actually get paid a salary. It's also the first one where you can wear a mawashi, the sashes the wrestlers wear, that's actually colored and you do get to pick the color, not just plain cotton, and where you wrestle all 15 days of a tournament. There are 28 ranks to climb within Juryo, and by the way, rank in sumo is expressed as a combination of east or west sides, plus the division, plus a number, with lower numbers being more prestigious. East usually comes first and has a little more prestige attached to it, so the best rank in Juryo is Juryo 1 East, followed by Juryo 1 West, followed by Juryo 2 East, and so on, with the lowest rank in Juryo being Juryo 14 West, the 28th spot in the whole division. Above Juryo, you finally make it to the top division, Makuuchi, or you sometimes hear it called Makunouchi. This is the part of sumo that gets the most coverage. It's the only one that, so far as I know, you can legally watch in the United States via NHK. And by the way, I get that only sickos watch Makushita and below, even though it is very fun sometimes, but come on NHK, at least let me legally watch Juryo too. There are 17 Makuuchi ranks, so 34 spots in total, though that can flex sometimes. And then above those are the big boys, the so-called 3 rolls or sanyaku, the championship ranks. Those are komusubi, the little knot, sekiwake, next to the side, and finally ozeki, champion. That's a lot of ranks to remember, but the basic system is pretty straightforward. You go up with more wins than losses, you go down with more losses than wins, and your rank, with one exception, is never fixed. There is, of course, one rank above them all, with its own special rules, but we'll get to that next week. For now, I just want to finish this week by starting Taiho's sumo career, which was very quick to get off the ground. He joined Nishino Sekibeya in the summer of 1956. By the September 1956 tournament, he was taking part in Maizumo, the pre-ranking competitions, and in the Hatsubasho, the New Year's tournament of January 1957. He started his climb up the ranks of the Bansuke. How'd it go? Well, we'll see next week. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show at our website, facingbackward.com, and you can donate to support the network on Patreon. Special thanks to new patrons Amy and Hachimitsu for donating to support the show. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for part 2.